Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of our podcast. I've been enjoying the different kind of guests that I've been hosting, the different topics. And so if you have been enjoying this, please hit the subscribe button at the bottom of this channel so you make sure you get even more interesting episodes in the future. Today, I have a special guest. All my guests are special, but he's special in a special way, let's say.
I feel particularly special. That's fair.
You are special. I would like to welcome Jack Leff.
Hello.
To my podcast. Jack, hello. Jack is a PhD candidate in Science and Technology Studies, a Climate Action Fellow for the university, and a grad student of the year 2022. His work focuses on what social movement can teach us about building better institutions, including educational institutions. And last but not least, he was the GPSS, which is the Graduate and Professional Students Senate President, I think for 2021 to 2022.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So there's a lot of room there to explore a lot of different topics. So welcome, Jack. Probably, to start with, most people know you through GPSS.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Whether it's in a famous or an infamous way, that depends on the person, right?
Yeah, their salary level directly correlates to that.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
You can publish a paper about that, I guess, the correlation.
Yeah.
But I'm only joking. I know you have done a lot of work for the GPSS. I think you had like 28 motions or something?
It was only 26 resolutions.
Resolutions, okay, yeah. So that's a lot to get done in 1 year. So I'm sure that is one of the major things you're known for, and I would like to discuss it today. But first, maybe let's warm up to it with something a little lighter.
Sure.
So I definitely want to get to the really interesting and unique set of courses that you teach, and want to talk about your teaching methodology and all of that. Before we start with that, I want to know you more. So I would like you to tell us more about yourself and give us a brief background about like how you reached here, what passions drove you to where you are now, what ambitions, what life choices you made to be here. Just I want to know you as Jack the person first.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm never mad about talking about myself, so I'm happy to do it. I knew I was going to be a teacher since elementary school, and so all of the choices I made in life were trying to get to the classroom. My best friend's mother was my preschool teacher, Miss Becky, and is still one of the most rock star teachers I know, and I've had the pleasure of talking to. I've hung around teachers all my life. I've had really good teachers all my life, and so I've always been passionate about education and knew that was something that I wanted to pursue. Initially, I thought I was going to be a science teacher, so I did my undergraduate in cellular and molecular biology, and I especially love viruses. Viruses were always just so cool to me. And I ended up getting a bachelor's of science in that, worked in labs for a couple of years, and realized hated it. Hated doing all the bench work, hated that my time was being controlled by microorganisms I couldn't see, and desired a little bit more control. And at the same time, I was taking a couple courses in philosophy just for fun, just because I'd gotten ahead of my coursework a little bit. And I ran into a faculty member at Appalachian State University named Rick Elmore, shout out to Rick, who basically convinced me that I could do this, that philosophy isn't just something you read in 17th century textbooks. It is, in fact, something that people still do today, and convinced me to, just send off an application. So I sent off 8 graduate school applications after my undergrad, was turned down for 7 of them, and the only one I was accepted to was the master's program in ethics and applied philosophy at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And so I imagine Rick was right and understood what my path was going to be even before I did, and I decided to go to Charlotte to pursue my master's. And that was a really big change of pace because I had been a science major, had been doing biochemistry and virology and all sorts of fun stuff. And then all of a sudden I was reading, 3 or 4 books a week in French philosophy and had a lot of catching up to do. But it was an absolute blast, and I loved that program, and I loved the people there, and it was life-changing. And then sort of two things at once happened when I was at Charlotte. The first is I got to teach. I TA'd mostly for two classes. One was called the Philosophy of Love and Sex. One was called the Philosophy of Death and Dying. And those were a very fun time, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. And the other thing happened was I started to get more politically involved. So I was politically involved before that in my undergrad degree, but not in a serious way. Like I'd show up to marches and rallies and talk to people and all that jazz. But I wasn't organizing stuff or getting into anything serious. But then in Charlotte in 2016, there was a police killing of an unarmed black man, Keith Lamont Scott. It got national attention in the news, and there were thousands of people out in the streets protesting it for over a month. The event's called the Charlotte Uprising. And I showed up to it because I just thought it was the right thing to do. I was studying social and political philosophy. I thought that if I'm going to study these, 19th century French people, I should also get some real world experience doing politics and see what it's like. That ended up being an incredibly serious set of protests over the course of a month. Over 100 people were arrested for it. I was followed around the city for months, which was fun. And it really gave me a lot of respect for social movements and the work they do. The way in which they model some of the same values that I believed in when it coming to the classroom. And it really got me thinking about the power of social movements to teach us something in these big league billion-dollar institutions about how to run the institutions better. Because, you get 10,000 people out there and they're spontaneously figuring out how to fight one of the most well-armed police forces in the world. In fact, the most well-armed police force in the world. They probably have something right to say about other institutions. Mm-hmm. And that's really when I started to think about bringing social movements into my pedagogy and really having these values be reflected in all my facets of life. So I got more seriously into political involvement in Charlotte. Then I came to Virginia Tech. Once again, I applied to a bunch of different universities. This was the only one I got into, so thank you to my department for being willing to take me. And I got into a PhD program in STS, which is a really interesting interdisciplinary field that exactly matched my research interests. They try to basically do exactly what I'm saying, take all these different values embedded in technologies, how technology gets created, social movements, policy, and they bring that all together in a really interesting way. So I've really felt a good academic home here. At the same time, I started to get involved in Virginia Tech politics. We're the biggest institution in the area. If you're going to get involved in politics in the New River Valley, you're going to bump into Virginia Tech. And I had done a number of things first, but really I started to have some success with our environmental policies. I was part of the student activist groups who changed our environmental policies and pushed forward the 2020 climate action commitment. That eventually led me to being hired as a staff member to support the implementation of the climate action commitment, which was a big mistake. It is an ambitious policy, and it's just so much work to implement. I always encourage people to be ideas people and not implementation people. But that's going really well. I'm just finishing up my first month. And if I could just offer a quick caveat, because I've always told to, my views on this podcast, of course, represent me as a teacher, as a student of Virginia Tech, and not the perspective of Virginia Tech, or on my behalf as a staff member of Virginia Tech. So I'm speaking purely as a graduate student, as a political activist, and as somebody who enjoys the classroom. But it also, my time at Virginia Tech also gave me a lot more political experience. I've been active for the last 5 years, and COVID was really a breaking point for me because I was looking around and I was like, oh, there's so many problems. They're going so unaddressed. The pandemic is just making a lot of the existing problems so much worse. And I really wanted to tackle it seriously. And so I became the president of the Graduate and Professional Student Senate. Over the summer, we drafted 25 to 26, I can't actually remember now, it was a lot, of resolutions, which are basically just how you introduce policy change in shared governance systems. Based on feedback we did 14 listening sessions at every college across the university. Mm-hmm. I believe in democracy. I believe in trying to, solicit feedback from the people who you're supposed to be representing. So I made sure to stop by every single college of the university, sometimes twice, which was a lot of time spent on listening, just to make sure that what the resolutions were going to do matched what the graduate students needed, expected, and wanted. Okay. And so we did that. We pushed it all through. It was a big mess. We got a lot of attention, but I'm pleased to say that at the end of the day, a full dozen of those policy changes passed in some form or another. And I fully suspect that we're going to see some of the echoes of that work for the next several years in terms of how graduate students get paid, how contracts work, family leave programs for graduate students. The staff $15 minimum wage was in part because we were pushing HR to implement that faster and faster. I'm very proud of the transformational initiatives we introduced to the university, even if it didn't make me a lot of friends sometimes.
Okay. That's a lot to unpack. If I take everything you said, I feel if I want to summarize you in one word, you're an activist at heart.
Yeah.
That seems to be the theme throughout your life.
Yeah.
So I promise I want to get to the teaching part first before the activism part. But I can't help but ask you one question because that question comes to me personally sometimes. When certain people are faced with the consequences of their activism, especially for the first time, you find certain people that run away and feel like, okay, I don't want to get involved with this. I just want to live my life. And other people, it actually pushes them more towards taking a more hardline stance on it, right?
Yeah.
So you're obviously from the latter type, right? I want to ask you, why was that the case for you? Why didn't you run away? What made you take the stance you took?
So there's an answer that makes me look really good, and then there's the answer that's actually true.
Okay.
The answer that's makes me look good is that I value things like justice, I value things like democracy, and the really peculiar thing about justice is that if you compromise on justice, you're just compromising justice itself. You can't basically take a half measure to justice. That makes absolutely no sense. Either an action is pushing forward justice or it's an obstacle to justice in some form, even if you're getting some concessions. And so for me, I think the doubling down comes out of that value and that commitment to justice. It's just the logical endpoint of if you believe in making change for the better. The actual answer that's less flattering, it's because I'm incredibly stubborn. I inherited this from my family. They would always joke that I was ultimately destined to be a lawyer because I would never let things go and I'd always fight them tooth and nail. And I just get so ingrained in these struggles that for me, it's just unthinkable that I could put it down just at an emotional level. And usually I end up punishing myself for that, just emotionally and physically. But whenever I'm confronted by these issues, it's truly pure stubbornness. And I think, part of that's a family history of activism. I'm named after my grandfather, who was an activist in Massachusetts, pushing for elder rights in particular, and was really pioneering for the time. I never got a chance to meet him, but you can still feel those echoes of that in the commitment to justice, in the fiery speeches that I give, I'm told sound exactly like him. And I'm desperate for any video footage. If anybody can find a Jack Leff from the 60s or 70s, please let me know. But yeah, I think it's just pure stubbornness at the end of the day.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you cherish that stubbornness, or do you feel like it's a weight on you?
I think I always cherish it. It really is, there are definitely consequences to my action, and I'm always happy to weather them. And I go into these situations knowing that that's the case. But for me, I really cherish it because it lets me be convinced that what I'm doing is the right thing and that I'm the kind of person who will pursue the right thing doggedly. And we brought it back around to flattering me somehow, but I really do think that that sort of stubbornness above all else has really led me down this path to trying to make change.
Okay. The reason I asked you, maybe not in terms of activism, but I'm also kind of a stubborn person. And, when I think something is right, I have to say what I think. And sometimes I'm like, why can't I just be like other people? Or not, I don't want to generalize other people, but why can't I just be chill? Is what I mean.
Yeah.
But I think if I consider dropping that, I feel that is betraying my character.
Yes.
And I just can't.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people feel the same about whatever they are passionate about, right? Yeah. So it's not just activism. I think it's admirable when people do that. They stand in the face of hardship because they believe in their character, or they believe in their drive, their
Yeah.
passion.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So the first thing that caught my attention in your introduction is the interesting and amazingly sounding classes that you have taught at Charlotte. You said Charlotte University, is that right?
University of North Carolina at Charlotte.
Oh.
Not to be confused with UNC, which is the prestigious school. Mine's the state school.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure. So you taught Death and Dying, I think it's called, and Sex and Love.
Yes.
So really, like, just the class itself, without even looking at the syllabus or anything, I'm like, okay, I really want to take that class. So I want to ask you, like, for these classes, first, can you give us a brief introduction about what do you talk about in these classes?
For sure. And I think that you hit the nail on the head that the titles are intentionally provocative to try to convince undergrads to sign up for them. They might be a little bit disappointed with the material itself when I get into it, but boy howdy, if you want to try to convince undergrads to take a philosophy class, calling it the philosophy of love and sex, great way to do it. And we really did some interesting work in these classes. In the humanities, we tend to read through different subject matters or canons, and we organize them around that. These classes, I was really blessed to have a lot of flexibility when I was teaching. So I was the TA during the discussion sections, but also communicated with the students regularly and attended all the regular sessions. And the professor supervising me, Shannon Sullivan, always let me, add my own material, talk about what was interesting for the graduate students. Ask the undergrads what they wanted to learn and then put readings later in the semester to match that and really be receptive to feedback in that way. But what it was for Love and Sex, it was a lot of Freud, it was a lot of Plato, and then we got into some more contemporary feminist issues around gender, sexuality, the knowledge of sexuality, who is allowed to have knowledge about their body, what does medicine do when it comes to, understudied aspects of the body. Really interesting contemporary topics that hooked the students. Anybody who was willing to suffer through the Plato and Freud. And then Death and Dying, it was a sort of similar story. We read a lot of the older existentialists. We read Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Camus, and we were really trying to get students to think critically about death and dying. And I think about that class a lot recently, actually, because one of the books we read was The Plague by Camus, and this was in 2016 and 2017. So long before we experienced the plague of 2020. But I often wonder how many of my students there were, think back to those days and, remember me lecturing about the plague and being like, I never thought this would come up, but my God, learning how to stay sane while quarantining turned out to be a very important life skill. And these were really fun classes to teach because it both exposed students to the classics, but also exposed them to some more contemporary ways that philosophy and ethics and existentialism are applied. And it also was really informative to my pedagogy. My supervisor, Shannon Sullivan, said that always made a joke that if you can teach death and dying, you can teach any class. If you can teach love and sex, you can teach any class, right? If 18-year-olds, you can hold their focus, they're not getting distracted, there's no immature jokes, you're doing a good job as a teacher.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say with such with the name of the class, there's such high expectations. So with high expectations comes high responsibility, really, because you have to deliver, right?
Yes.
Right. So, but listening to the brief account of the syllabus you had for both, I think it's really a really interesting set of topics combined in one or two classes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, how did you compile this syllabus? Is that something you did on your own? Is that something was handed to you? Did you make any modifications or not? What was your thought process, if any, in creating these syllabus?
Yeah, so the a lot of the times when you're first TAing a class, the bulk of the syllabus was created. So, we knew we were going to do 4 weeks of Plato. We knew we were going to do 4 weeks of Freud. We knew we were going to get in these contemporary discussions. But I was very lucky that early on in my teaching career, I was handed a lot of flexibility about, okay, if I'm just teaching 1/3 of every class, the Friday sections, what do I want to teach? What do I find engaging? Do I have secondary material on the Plato and Freud that can bring it to the contemporary area and make it a little bit more relatable for the students? especially towards the back half of the class, when we started getting all of these issues of contemporary feminist knowledge production and science, and the way that science has always unevenly produced knowledge to skew towards a masculine lens, we had a lot of flexibility to then bring in other articles. So things like thinking about how the pathologization of gayness, of queerness, of bisexuality then resonates throughout this history of medical technologies was a really interesting thing to the students, and they were really engaged in that. For death and dying, just getting them to think about, what are the major sources of death in the United States? Thinking about, what does it mean that people often die in hospital settings, and that matters, that you're going to probably experience sitting next to somebody in a hospital bed as this common ritual for what we all experience as dying. And to know that, how are you going to grapple with that before you get to that point, and what is that going to mean to you, and is there something about the sterility of the hospital bed that might be an obstacle to mourning, right? And thinking about what they want for their own death. Really somewhat challenging questions, but ones that the undergrads always took, a huge shine to and really loved. So I was very lucky that I got a lot of flexibility to build on those themes, and especially around making them a little bit more relevant to the day-to-day lives of the undergrads.
Okay, I see. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I actually, that leads me to my next question is, I come from a STEM discipline. So for us, when you teach a class, there is a set of skills and maybe techniques, methodology that you need to learn, because when you're graded on that class, that grade reflects how much you have mastered those skills. And according to the tradition or the department or whatever, those skills are necessary for you to be a reliable engineer, for example, or reliable scientist, right? So the learning outcome is very well defined, okay? Especially that it's very numerical, quantitative, all of that, right? Now, in such, for you, it's more like it's philosophy, right? Or maybe social sciences in general, but philosophy is even more abstract, right?
Yeah.
So, you as a teacher of philosophy, what is the learning outcome you're looking for? How do you measure that people have learned, right? I'm curious about that.
For sure, and it's one of the most important things to me, because the classroom's supposed to be transformational. The students going into it shouldn't be the same people as the students coming out of it. Something needs to have changed. And so for me, that's the ultimate benchmark of whether I've done my job, is whether they've, regardless if they can regurgitate, the 5 forms or the 5 steps to get to forms for Plato, the 5 definitions of love that Socrates supposedly talks about, the different kinds of sexuality that Freud talks about. Far and beyond that, what's more interesting to me is that they've undergone some sort of transformation from beginning to end. And that's much harder to quantify, because for each student, that's going to be different. They're going to get something different out of each of these materials. There are concrete skills we try to develop in our students. So in all my classes, I try to teach writing. I think that being an effective writer, which isn't the same thing as being a grammatically correct writer. I've never been a grammatically correct writer, but I have always been an effective writer. Okay. Is a really important skill just in day-to-day life. Most people will do a lot of writing, reports, newspaper articles, op-eds, emails, and teaching people how to be less stressed out about their writing and also to write more effectively in a voice that makes sense to them is always something that I try to achieve. And you can usually see pretty good progress from the first paper to the last paper that they submit at the end of every year. The other big skill that we try to teach is critical thinking, which is, a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, but I have not been convinced that other disciplines teach it as well as some of the more humanitarian disciplines. I remember back from my biology days exactly what you're talking about, right? For biologists, it's usually the endless memorization of cell pathways. Here are the biochemical reactions. All right, now you get to learn some organic chemistry. Some really fun stuff there. And in every one of my classes, I distinctly remember the professor telling me that we're going to learn critical thinking, and me just being like, I don't think that's what we're doing here. And it really wasn't until I got to some of these ethics courses where I was thinking deeply about my own choices, the choices of others, how institutions work, how we often don't question how institutions work, and that leads us to doing unethical things. that's when I really felt that I was starting to get at the critical thinking skill set. And I try to pass on that love to students, because when you're doing something like critical thinking well, it causes you to like change how you look at the world. Like it fundamentally reorients you to it. To borrow some language from a philosopher named Elhamod. And I got addicted to that feeling, I got to tell you. And I think that you can see it in some students' eyes. They also really get into that. And at the end of the day, I'm just hoping to make all my students better people at the outset of the class. My big joke is that, people go through K through 12 education, they get indoctrinated into certain ideas. So all my undergrads that come to my classroom are just oftentimes just like little fascists sometimes. Okay. And my goal is to make them less fascist.
Okay.
And that's tongue-in-cheek. I love my students. They're not actually fascists. But I do hope that at the end of the day, they're better people. And that's the sort of barometer that I measure the success of my teaching.
Okay.
Which is abstract, and I'm going to give you a philosophical answer no matter what.
Right.
But as much as we try to, you can't quantify ethics. But I do think it's a pretty good sort of North Star to make decisions around my teaching and education style. And I try to be upfront with my students about that too. I try to tell them, like, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to, work with you, talk with you, have us both become better people.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really great. So, like, you mentioned two things. First of all is writing effectively, and second of all is the critical thinking part. And I find the first one very interesting because, to me, philosophy is notorious of writing in a way that no one can understand. Like, once upon a time, I tried to read Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah.
I did not make it past 10 pages. I just could not.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not that. That's not an expert's opinion.
Yeah.
That's a layman's
opinion.
For sure. Like, I just could not. I could not read it.
For sure.
So I really feel like I wish philosophy was more accessible and approachable, because it's such a fascinating and important topic.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you for that.
Well, and if I could just respond to that really quickly. No, because this is, I think, an important point, because you're 100% right. And I actually also tried to read Nietzsche before I became a philosopher, bounced off of it completely. Yeah. Was told, this guy's profound, he's fantastic. Started reading him, like, I have no idea what the hell he's talking about. And I'm reminded about something that I was taught by one of my first mentors, Rick Elmore, which is, he always had these great lines, and he would say, nobody can do philosophy alone. And that's what, I think the biggest con is that we get taught that if you just read these books, that's doing philosophy. And that's not the case, right? If you are doing philosophy, you're talking with other people. And this goes for all the humanities. Right. You got to be working with other people. And that's, whether it's in a classroom, you're sort of working collaboratively, whether that's, doing research, it always has to be done with other people. And I didn't understand philosophy until that clicked with me. That when I was with the classroom with Rick, among peers who were also struggling with these ideas that are hard, it was the process of struggling together that really gave us the deepest insights, not only into the material, because I love Beyond Good and Evil. The first chapter of that is fantastic. But you will not understand it unless you have, collaborative discussion, you have some context maybe from a guidance, like through a professor or an older student or something. Like, it's always this give and take. And I find that collaborative ethos really important to my pedagogy, which is why I wanted to stop, because I just love that idea of, we all try to read philosophy alone and are shocked when it doesn't work.
That's really interesting. I've never heard this concept before, like collaborative philosophy. That's really, because for me, whenever I imagine a philosopher, it's like someone sitting in a dark room with a candle and like thinking on their own. So I appreciate that you brought a different angle to philosophy. And I'll have to think about that more.
They lie to you. I mean, that's the, there's a lot of criticisms of so-called armchair philosophy or ivory tower philosophy that are completely valid, mostly because we talk about Descartes and Kant and people like that who sit and do exactly what you described. But for me, the philosophers that get me out of bed in the morning, and the humanities scholars and my colleagues who are really, engaging and I think have the best pedagogy, all believe in the collaborative spirit of education. It just is so fundamental to the way they understand reading, but also teaching and writing, and it all comes tangled up together in a beautiful way.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, the second one is critical thinking.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in this because Okay, before I give my opinion, let's ask you what does critical thinking mean to you? What can you unpack that term?
Sure, and I'm going to give the stereotypical answer for the humanities, which is that I think when you're doing critical thinking effectively, you're taking familiar concepts and you're making them strange, so that you can interrogate them and think about them more deeply without the underlying assumptions we typically make about different ideas.
Okay.
So it's literally staring at something so hard, it becomes unfamiliar. It's that feeling, but like looking at political ideas or social ideas or structural ideas. And I'll usually start off my classes by revealing how the structure of the classroom structures the way my students interact with me. So for example, like when I'm trying to get them to think about critical thinking, I'm like, okay, here's what you need to do. Why are all your desks facing me? Right?
Okay.
Like it's something we don't think about because we've been taking 12 years of education, maybe more if I get a junior or senior in my class, and it's the same format for every classroom you're in for over a decade. It fades into the background. You don't think about it. But what I'm telling my students is like the reason all the desks are facing me is because I'm facing all of you is because that signals something about the authority in this classroom.
Right.
It's saying I'm in charge and you're seated and listening.
Okay.
Right. And what by telling them this, it undermines my authority a little bit. I can still maintain my authority in other ways. But my point is to get them to think about how even something as benign as the shape of the classroom, once you make it unfamiliar, once you make it strange, once it's like an alien looking in and be like, why are we teaching people like this? All of a sudden, things become revealed. You start to see how the circulation of knowledge in this space is done, how it really is just the professor at the head of the room distributing knowledge to the students.
Okay.
And that's just a stereotypical example, but once you start to go down this route, all sorts of things start to look real weird to you. So I would define it as just making the familiar strange to try to get something more out of it.
Gotcha. So taking that example, the students facing the traditional way of like all the students facing you.
Yeah.
Maybe can you offer us how do you do your class? Like what is your teaching methodology here? Instead, any certain methods or techniques you have used that maybe challenge the traditional way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just the act of explaining to them why it's set up that way, I think, is the first thing I always do. I always like to give my students a little peek behind the curtain of how teachers work. So I'll talk about like, okay, what is a professor thinking of when they write your test, right?
Okay.
Like what is their mindset? Because that's something students don't think about. They study I remember this in my biology classes. They study the material, they memorize the facts, but not once do they think about like, what is the faculty member thinking about when they're writing these questions? But if they thought about that, all of a sudden you can start guessing most questions on a test, right? I know what's going to be on my evolutionary biology test. I was in the class. I know what my professor was really invested in asking me about. And it makes my life so much easier. So I love to give them those peeks behind the curtain. Really, the first thing that I do is I almost always negotiate the syllabus with my students.
Okay.
So I'll usually give them one or two examples of what the class could look like, some major themes and readings that we're going to tackle, but I always like to give them an option to buy into the class. And there's sort of two reasons for this. One is I always learn from the students, and so when I suggest a topic they're interested in, usually it's something that I didn't think they'd be interested in or something more contemporary or relatable to them, and I always want to make an effort to include that because that gets them thinking and talking a little bit more. And the other reason is it just creates a buy-in to the class. Like it's their class. I'm here to facilitate that. I know more about a lot of topics than my students because I've been reading this stuff for a decade now. I have some genuine advantages here that I'm going to pass on. But for me, teaching has to be interactive and dialogical. It has to be transformational for both of us. And I want my students to buy into the class and having a role in it, as having designed part of it even. And I'm going to make that easy for them because I don't want them to necessarily, all right, now come up with 18 different weeks of readings and then I'm just going to lead you through whatever the hell you'd pick. But what I do want is for them to have a genuine investment in it, and I will structure the class to their interests almost always. I'll even negotiate the assignments and the way I grade them.
Okay.
I remember the last semester I taught, I gave my students an option. I'm like, we've all been going through a pandemic for a while. Sure, everybody's exhausted. I am happy to run this like a traditional class where you get quizzes and you get tests and all that jazz. Or we can do a little bit less formal of a grading structure where every week you send me your reading notes just to show me that you read. They don't have to be accurate. They don't have to be, good notes. But they do have to be show me that like you engage with the material in some capacity. Then no quizzes. you know?
Okay.
Or I offered they could pitch me an alternative assignment as well for instead of reading notes, just to let them use their own creativity and think of something I never could have. Instead of tests, we're like, okay, well, what do we want to do? And what can we do given the fact that we're in a pandemic and want to keep people safe? So we ended up doing a really interesting assignment that I then continued to reuse for other classes, involving taking pictures of what's called hostile architecture outdoors, right?
Okay.
Basically, these physical features of the built environment that enable people to pass through or don't enable people to pass through.
Okay.
And, this ties into the hostile architecture unit I was teaching, and it was a really good time. But what it led to was, students were taking pictures of benches that had armrests in it that they had never thought about before, right? And this is the critical thinking thing. When you look at a bench with armrests, you just think, that's a bench with armrests.
Right.
But after this unit, they were starting to apply this critical thinking lens, and they were taking pictures of these benches, and were like, well, if you have a bench with an armrest, you can't lay down on the bench.
Right.
Who lays down on benches that society is trying to prevent from laying down on benches, or local city governments? Homeless people.
Right.
So I had them go around, take pictures of these sort of benign everyday objects. Trash cans were another big one. People love trash cans. Just to be like, okay, who is this accessible to and who is this inaccessible to? How does this change the way you interact with something as simple as a park bench, right? And I feel like they got a lot of joy out of that assignment. I got some really interesting answers. One of my favorites, and I think I can talk about this, one of my favorites was somebody wrote about cell phone sizes being gendered. So depending on the size of your hand, the size of the cell phone might be more or less comfortable. And because there's oftentimes, on average, a gender distinction, that creates the situation where the increasing size of smartphones makes it so that they're unusable for some people and more usable for other people. And I never thought about that, but what a clever example of just day-to-day life.
It is very interesting.
Yeah. And I love these assignments where the students get to teach me something that I never thought about. I had some international students who were taking pictures of their hometowns and the different kinds of architecture. There was some anti-bike architecture that we don't necessarily have in the United States, and it was really fascinating to see the different approaches by local governments to the way they structure space to encourage biking, discourage biking, encourage skateboarding, discourage skateboarding. Where do you store your bike? All those questions I never thought about. And that's really the joy of having the sort of negotiation period at the start of class is they always get to teach you something you wouldn't expect, and I love that. Keeps it interesting for me.
That's pretty cool. Okay. I actually want to contrast that with okay, so I don't know if you're familiar with the Great Courses. Have you heard about that platform? Okay.
No.
Okay, so there's an online platform called the Great Courses. They changed the name to Wondrium lately, but Great Courses, think about it as lecture series, Netflix kind of thing.
Yes.
Lecture series.
Like the Harvard lecture sort of stuff or the Yale lecture sort of stuff that they put online.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, you can do that, but it's probably more the production is higher quality.
I see.
The production is higher quality, and it has a very broad range of different topics like history, geography, computer science, math, physics. So whatever you're interested in, you can find. But the production is very high quality. And they have really interesting courses. So one of the courses I was watching, lectures I was watching, is about effective teaching. And the guy was teaching this. Sorry, I forgot his name. I'm not really good with names. The guy was teaching this. He said an interesting thing that for him, he feels effective teaching necessitates that the teacher establishes authority, and the student needs to feel slightly uncomfortable. And what he meant by slightly uncomfortable is that the student needs to have a motivation to pay attention. And for example, one way you can establish that is by telling the students, I might engage you in the class with no advanced warning. Maybe I would be discussing something. It's okay, Mohannad, what do you think about this, right? So what are your thoughts on this in contrast with, you advocate for maybe less authority, right? Is there a line between the two? Where do you think that line is? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that authority is one of the sort of unspoken values in the classroom that I really try to think about in my pedagogy. And I don't claim to be an expert. There are people who work on this for their entire life. But my perspective is I always try to skew for less authority, but I don't necessarily give up authority completely.
Okay.
And so I will tell my students that the way the classroom is organized is meant to direct authority towards me, but I still need to keep a modicum of, organization in the classroom, so I don't change the way the seats are arranged. I could put them in a circle.
Okay.
And there are some activities where, it might be better to do that. So if I'm doing like a peer review activity, I'll move the seats around and take advantage of the space. But if I'm talking with them and we're having a back and forth, I still keep it in the arrangement.
Okay.
Similarly, like I will always be better dressed than my students, right? Because that's another way that we can protect our authority.
Right.
Authority also has racial, gendered, and ability dimensions that I think are often unspoken in pedagogy. If you're a man, you're automatically going to have more authority in the classroom than if you're not a man, if you're non-binary, if you're a woman.
True.
And I think that the degree of authority I can hold is different, and the sort of things I can get away with are different than some of my colleagues. And so I don't think that there's like a hard line where I think that, okay, we should all be doing these things. We should probably all be a little bit less dictatorial in our classrooms. I feel comfortable saying that. But we all have different techniques for managing our authority in the classroom. And my colleagues that I value will give up a lot of authority that you see in the traditional classrooms from people who perhaps don't think about authority, right? Who just preserve this arrangement and don't think about it or are just lecturing at you. But they still hold on to authority to some degrees, and in ways that I might give up because I have natural authority based on who I am and my identities. And so for that reason, I think that authority is a really sticky subject, and I'm not willing to get rid of it completely.
Okay.
I'd be open to push back against that argument, for sure. I think that there are definitely better ways that I could be teaching. But I do definitely try to reduce authority.
Okay.
And I think the second point in some ways is really interesting because it's the distinction between creating negative or positive incentives. When you're afraid of a pop quiz, you'll pay attention, and that works. It's worked for teachers for decades now. I think it's a little easy to do, to be honest. If I can be a little hot take for a second, I think that throwing out pop quizzes and scaring the students is pretty easy to do. I think the harder thing is getting the students to engage with the material on its own merit, and trying to get them to engage based on the fact that they find it interesting and they're invested in their own growth. Okay. And so one of the things I learned early on in my teaching with philosophy of love and sex and philosophy of death and dying is that you don't necessarily need the specter of tests and pop quizzes to get students to engage. If the subject matter is talking about something that they're interested in, like let's say how one of the most popular weeks in love and sex was when we were talking about how little we know about things like the clitoris from a medical perspective, and the politics behind that, and the gendered politics behind that. And the students were talking the entire session and really engaged with the material.
Right.
A little bit less so with Plato.
Right.
But, oftentimes what makes this difficult is that teachers are not used to teaching controversial ideas that might be interesting, ideas that push the boundaries of their students' knowledge, push them to engage more, or even teach things about students' own life. A lot of these faculty members are, and maybe I'll change as I get older, but a lot of the faculty members are decades removed from the undergraduates they teach. That makes it harder to get a sense of what the day-to-day life of the students are unless you seriously talk to them and take some of your power away to structure the class. And so for me, I always try to think about these things in terms of power and returning power to the students to be able to make changes, to be able to control their education in this way. And I find that they buy into it pretty effectively.
Right. I have to say, in a class like love and sex, probably it is somewhat doable to excite the student about the material and not spend too much energy in getting their attention. In more dry and maybe technical subjects, I find it takes a lot of imagination and passion and work to make a subject really exciting and interesting. Like if I am teaching you about linear algebra and eigenvalues and all of that, like it's going to take a really passionate teacher to come up with real life examples where this is useful, and not only useful, it has to be, I don't want to say fun, but something that is a little captivating to, like, why should I care about this, right? So I feel some subject matters definitely lay themselves a lot easier than others. And it really takes sometimes a very talented and passionate teacher to make a subject without using like the scare tactics of quizzes and stuff, to make a subject really interesting to their students.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that what that speaks to, if we can go a little bit far afield, is especially in higher education, the degree of training we get as teachers, or really lack thereof, right? Because I agree with you. I think that there are definitely some classes that are much harder to make engaging than others. Even in philosophy, there's a huge disparity between like, okay, it's easy to get somebody invested in love and sex. How do you get somebody invested in ancient philosophy?
Yeah.
How do you get somebody invested in Kantian ethics?
Right.
And so pedagogists have tried a lot of different ways to develop that. And really what I think it comes down to is I really wish this was the universal norm to respect teaching and for faculty members to be rewarded for putting that kind of effort in. Yeah. But the reality of the higher education institution is that that's not where the rewards are.
Yeah.
And if I can spend 10 hours trying to make my virology class interesting, that's 10 hours I'm not spending putting out publications. That's 10 hours I'm not spending writing grants to support my grad students in my research lab, let alone the university who takes a 60% cut. That's 10 hours of opportunity cost. And for people who are already working a ton, that means a lot. Yeah. And so I fully get why people tend to default to this, and why most of not all of it, I had some excellent biology teachers in my undergrad, but for the most part, the norm was quizzes regularly once a week, tests once every 4 or 5 weeks, depending if we had 3 or 4 tests. And you memorize a bunch of stuff.
Right.
I get why they did that. I just wish that we could revalue education as the primary thing in universities. And I think that would change. I think we'd put a lot more emphasis on cultivating and teaching teachers how to be engaging, even in the most difficult subjects.
Right.
And this is also a political organizing problem too, because a lot of what my job is when I'm trying to be political is like, how do I get people to read the Virginia Tech budget?
Okay. Yep.
It's an 80-page document. It's a nightmare. I've read 4 or 5 of them now. How do you get that to be interesting? How do you make that relevant to people? What do you sell in that to make it sexy and appealing to want somebody to be like, okay, I'm going to take time out of my busy schedule as a grad student or an undergrad or a staff member or faculty member, and I'm going to sit down and read this document that doesn't help my work. And in fact, will probably make me an enemy. I mean, to be able to convince people to come together around those ideas is hard.
Right.
But it's the same exact thing as teaching, where how do you get people to find, cell biology interesting? I think there's a ton of ways, but we just don't structure the university in ways to give them time or to value it.
There is no incentive.
Exactly.
It's really, especially in an R1 university
Exactly.
like here, it's always about research.
Yeah.
Which takes me back to the whole critical thinking kind of thing, because the incentive, I've brought this up in this podcast before,
For sure.
but I want to talk about it again. Like, the incentive is always to publish.
Yeah.
And I have my entire life, I had the childhood like yours, where I grew up in a family that really cherishes education. And I've always been excited about being a professor one day, like teaching, specifically teaching.
Yeah.
And I was so shocked and surprised once I joined graduate school. Because all my life I thought graduate school is about critical thinking and is about, reaching to truth. Of course there's experiment and stuff, but then it's about obtaining truth, right? And I am really shocked because after so many years in grad school, I feel like that's not what researchers do. Researchers just figure out ways to get published.
Yes.
And that sometimes, because there is a famous saying, once you define a metric, it ceases being a metric, right? Because people try to find ways around it to get to achieve that score high in that metric without really doing what the metric was put in place to begin with, right? I see a lot of corner cutting. I see a lot of practices. I'm like, yeah, but this is not science. It will get me published, but this is not science, right? So I also I get very concerned about this whole critical thinking things. I don't know if education is really about critical thinking anymore, and that's really, when I think about that, it really scares me.
I'm terrified, and you see this in the PIB model that the university is moving towards, which I'm not going to even try to attempt to explain, but you see this in all the attempts to make undergraduates like customers or consumers rather than students engage in a lifelong project of learning with us. And it's really you see this on social media all the time too. People treat Virginia Tech like it's a degree mill to farm out engineers who then get employed. And it's not that. But ideally, as an educational institution, we're doing something greater. We have a different mission. And I worry about that a lot. I wish I had an optimistic answer, but really it's just going to require completely revaluing how we do education to try to reinforce that idea of we are here to teach and to work with students and to have people grow. And we produce knowledge, in part to further a lot of human endeavors like medicine or science or philosophy, but also to continue developing the pool of things we get to teach to students.
Right.
I'd love to think about what would a research program look like whose goal is to develop interesting truths to then teach to students and for students to engage with complex, interesting truths. And I simply don't know what that would look like, but I hope I live long enough to see higher education do an about turn.
I share your outlook too. I think it's such an important pursuit to do that, but again, the problem is always incentive. I don't know who's and how this incentive is going to be created, but if the incentive stays the way it is now, I don't know. It's going to be very challenging.
Yeah, I think about something horrifying. One of my colleagues, Monique DeFore here, who's one of the best teachers of Virginia Tech, by the way. One of the things she said that's always stuck with me is that when you're really, really good at teaching, when your students love you and they give you the best reviews and you get recognized for teaching, your reward is that you get to teach less. Like you get a sabbatical or a reduction of load. And it's like we're punishing our best teachers and having them do more research if they teach too well. And so I think about all the science classes where they're making this work boring, and I'm like, of course they are. If they teach too well, they're not going to be allowed to teach.
Yeah. Sad.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Yeah. It really sticks with you.
Yeah. We can talk a whole episode about just this part, but I want to discuss one last thing about this whole teaching thing before we move to GPSS.
Sure.
You mentioned a little bit how you try to have your students buy into the class, have a say in how to conduct the class, and maybe I don't know what they're graded on probably. So I want to talk about the grading part.
Yeah.
It's always a contentious topic, and I've talked to so many people about some people believe grading is important. Some people it's everyone gets an A. So I want to get your opinion on what do you think about that, and what is your approach to grading? And more for me it's important because the way this compares to STEM again, in STEM it's very numerical. You can say, okay, do you have the right answer? Okay, no, -1 grade, right? In philosophy and even social sciences, it's a lot more qualitative.
Yeah.
So what is your approach in the courses you taught? How do you handle grading?
Yeah, one of the first things I say in every course that I teach is I definitely err on the side of I want everybody to get an A. That's my dream.
Okay.
This is another thing I stole from Rick Elmore shamelessly also. And by the way, for the audience at home, almost all your best teachers have stolen all of their teaching tricks from other good teachers. It's just a cannibalistic system. So I'm referencing a lot of the teachers because I believe in credit, but my entire teaching style is cannibalized from all my best teachers. But Rick Elmore used to start his classes, and I do the same thing with saying, my dream is for everybody to get an A in this class. And I haven't been able to do it yet, but I really hope that someday I can do that. Because my dream is to get to a class where nobody's really worried about their grades and they're confident they're going to do well, where everybody's engaged and I don't get any no-call, no-shows who just don't engage with the material or show up at all. And I truly do wish that happens. I know there's a lot of debates around grading pedagogy. There's ungrading as a different system, contract grading, and I'm not familiar enough with the literature to have a strong opinion about that. For me, I sort of treat it relatively simple. My goal is for everybody to get an A or to have some sort of similarly achieved grade where they felt like they succeeded. And if I had my way, nobody would stress out about grades.
Okay.
I dream of being able to get away with not grading for an entire year, right? Okay. For me, I just find it a little bit tiresome. And I'd rather just give helpful feedback that people take seriously rather than try to do the qualitative work and assign a numerical value. I think this is something in the humanities we don't talk about enough, but it's just so subjective. And I'm comfortable with that. Like you get a good sense of what like an A paper should look like for a 1,000 level class, what a B paper should look like. I don't want to pretend it's like entirely subjective, but why are we trying to do this when our goal is qualitative feedback, right? Like we want to teach people how to be better writers, and you don't do that by giving them a 60 on their essay.
Okay.
You do that by telling them, here's what you did well and should continue doing. Here's what you did poorly and how you could fix it. Here's how economy of space works. And there's a real disconnect between how grades try to quantify feedback and how the humanities are trying to teach you qualitative skills that you've hit on. And I wish I had a better answer other than it's really messy and it's a fundamental problem.
Do you think so? I don't know. From what you said, I feel you think some disciplines lay themselves more easily to grading quantitatively, but some are more qualitative, and maybe they should be like I don't know, pass fail, or I don't know, you know, something like that. Because I get what you're saying, that you know, you care more about the feedback you give to the student than the grade. But in the STEM, on this other side in the STEM, like let's say you're an engineer, right, and you're going to design a bridge. If you don't know how to design a bridge, that there are lives that depend on this, right?
Yeah.
So I think in that case, it makes sense that there is a grade, because we want to know how good an engineer is. You are, right? It's not just I don't think it's simply a pass or fail, unless you consider the pass to be like, you know, you're really, really good, otherwise you fail, kind of thing. Like so I don't know, I still feel like there are certain ways, there are certain places where the grade has a meaning, because we want to rely on, if the university says this engineer is good, that carries responsibility, that carries a meaning, a weight, right?
Sure.
Whereas in the humanities, I am not very familiar with what a good philosopher is versus a bad philosopher, but maybe it's not so like no lives really count on it in a direct way. So maybe we can get away with no grading. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question. I think that you're right to point out that some disciplines are better suited for quantitative grades than others. I would disagree, and this is probably my actual hot take, that in any situation, quantitative grades are actually giving you more meaningful insight into a better or worse person or engineer, right?
Okay.
And I think that it's mostly because of how we structure our evaluation that we start to think that numerical grades are a sign of success. And I think that if we look at practicing engineers, you'll find this in any field, not just engineering, but business or finance or you know, I keep listing just economic ones. Business, finance, STEM, you know, the best scientists are very often the ones who didn't succeed to the level of their peers. They're not the top graduates of an engineering program. The best engineers are ones who have the ability to think through problems in a critical way and have both the tools they know how to design the bridge, but also an understanding of the social uses of bridges. One of the common examples in my field is about a bridge that Robert Moses built in New York City. It was basically, so Robert Moses, one of the greatest undeniable architects of all time, designed most of New York, but ended up creating some really harmful architecture because he lacked a lot of these sort of ethical dimensions to his work. Okay. So in this one example, he built a bridge with the overpass was smaller than the buses that were common in the New York public transit system at the time. And the idea was that this bridge was basically guarding beachfront property. He didn't want poor people on his beach. So he basically built a bridge that was low enough to make it so that you couldn't take a bus to this bridge. It was physically impossible. Okay. And so even though, he built a successful bridge, I think it's still standing if my memory serves, but just because you build a successful bridge and have the skills to do that doesn't mean it's a good bridge. And for me, that's really what the humanities excel at, because you're right, there are a certain set of discrete skills that you need to be able to build a bridge, and we should be able to identify concretely whether or not somebody can do that. But on the other hand, if you think about the use of philosophy or ethics, I would argue the inverse of what you said, which is that ethics have far more bearing on our day-to-day lives than anything else. Because if you think about it, when a president of the United States is making decisions, the thing that distinguishes between a good president or a bad president, although I'm not convinced we have had any good presidents, is their ethical commitment to the people, is their commitments to these more abstract philosophical concepts like democracy or justice, And you can tell when a president doesn't have those because it ends up costing millions of people their lives. Somebody's willingness to go to war is a direct result of their philosophical commitments. So I would actually argue that more lives are in the hand of these qualitative fields in some ways, even if it's less, one-to-one as you build a bridge and people go over it and you don't want it to collapse.
Okay. I see your point, and I am willing to take back what I said. So you made a good argument there. But that even makes the situation even harder because now the question is, humanities are as important, if not more important than STEM, let's say. But then how do you assess someone that this is a good philosopher versus bad philosopher? If you're saying grading is not the right way to do it, I wonder, do you think grading is not the way, or do you think the way we do grading now, or what we grade for, is the problem? Like, is it the method, or is it the concept of grading itself? Especially in the humanities. What do you think?
I think it's the concept of grading itself, and the reason I think that is because I'm not willing to go full moral relativist here and say that, like, once you start doing qualitative methods, there are some ideas that are better than others, right? Like, it's not purely subjective. We're not sitting around here just having discussions that are abstracted, hopefully. That happens, of course, and those are terrible classrooms. But, ideally, some ideas are better than others, and we try to fight to get to that place. I think that we've lost sight of that in the name of trying to quantify all of our problems to have concrete solutions. Because it turns out that a lot of these social and even physical infrastructure have really messy implications to them that we have to take into account and simply can't when we reduce things to numbers. And that's not to say that reducing things to numbers is unimportant. Like, when you're doing cell research and you stain a cell and you're getting the specific numeric readout of how much the dye is being produced by the bacteria or whatever, that tells you something, and that's important. But I think when it comes to something like education, where the goal should be not just preparing people for a job, but producing better people, I think it's hard to quantify what a better person is. And I think that the error in grading is that no matter how well you do it, as long as you're being reductive in this way, that it's never going to be the most useful tool for judging whether or not education has succeeded. I think that instead a better litmus test might be looking around and seeing, if education is about making better people, like transforming people to be better, what does our society look like? I think that's a direct reflection and a direct evaluation of our educational programs. And I think it's no surprise that when we start to see state defunding of higher education and of public education, we also start to see less critical thinking. We start to see polarization towards fascist ideas. We start to see a decline in a lot of the things that had been improving previously, including just students getting caught in debt traps, which is a whole other topic. But nonetheless, I think that, it's not one-to-one. These things are always complicated. But I think that maybe instead of using grades, the barometer we can use is something like societal well-being. But I might also just be a little romantic there when it comes to education. That might not help administrators do their day-to-day activity.
Yeah, it's certainly complicated. Like, I can see how it's more qualitative and probably even subjective. So I don't from what I get out of this is that we don't have answer. We know what is not working. Not necessarily what the solution is. Or what would work.
I defer to more experienced people who work on pedagogy to give better answers. I don't claim to be one of those. I will tell you what's wrong, though. It's probably capitalism.
Cool. Okay, bottom line.
That's what I really just want my students to get away with. I'm the indoctrinating teacher.
Cool. Awesome. This was really great. Thank you.